This video will attempt to explain to you how to do financial setup in Clarity. This is not an area that I've had to delve into too extensively. I think I can give you a pretty good overview, but beyond what I have to say here, you may want to peruse some CA documentation. So the basic idea is Clarity has a number of financial capabilities built into it. Most AZ users are familiar with doing cost plans in Clarity and importing transactions and being able to see actual costs against projects. In addition, you can do things like generate invoices if you're using Clarity to track billable hours that you are if you're a consulting shop and you've got consultants that record their time and then you want to bill your customers or your clients for their time, you can actually create invoices and do a number of fairly extensive things. For our purposes, we haven't used this too heavily other than the cost plan arena. So in order to set up the financial structure, you would go to the administration module and go to setup under finance. Now there's a number of things in here. We have kept it extremely simple. The key entry on this screen is entities. So everything maps up to a financial entity, and we only have one because we only have one organization. But if you're a conglomerate or you're a company with a lot of subsidiaries, you could define separate entities for each different organization within your conglomerate or each subsidiary within your company, and all of them could have their own financial structure. If you ever reach the point where you need to create multiple entities, you're probably going to want to get CA involved to consult with you on how best to do this anyway. So for now, I'll just leave it that we need one entity. Now, the entity itself has some significant ramifications. If I drill into it, I can see there's a fair amount of information associated with it. The financial structure in Clarity depends upon a number of interrelated factors, but ultimately it's tracking costs. And costs can be either labor or material or equipment or expense. You can treat all of these differently, and when computing the cost of a particular type of labor, you define a rate matrix. And you do the same thing for material costs, equipment, and expenses. So there are some out-of-the-box financial rate matrices that are pretty boring and don't have much in them because we don't use these categories. For labor, we have defined an AstraZeneca labor rate matrix. And there will be a separate video on maintaining the rate matrix because we do use that in building cost plans. The other thing that's useful here is that there are defaults defined for this entity. The default investment class is standard, WIP class is standard, and company class is internal. If I go back to my setup page, I can see where you would define those. Let me go back to setup. There are resource classes, company classes, investment classes, and so on. So we'll take a quick tour of these. The resource classes, we have a whole bunch of them defined. I don't know that we're using any of them other than Global Engineering uses the two that I set up for them. We also set up not too long ago internal high, medium, and low resource classes. I'm not sure who's using them or why. The rest of these I think are old. They were set up probably in 2012. And I don't know that we are still utilizing them in any way. The one that we use most often is default. So for IT resources, we assign them a resource class of default. Similarly, company classes, we only have one. We only have internal companies. Work in progress classes, we just have one. It's standard. Investment classes, we have two. Standard and non-chargeable. So if you have a project that can't be charged, you can set the entire project to non-chargeable and you won't see any costs on it. And then transaction classes, we have a few, and these are the ones that are most familiar to users of our system because we have these transaction classes associated with line items in a cost plan. And this is where you define them. So if someone says, I need a new transaction class, you would go to administration, finance setup, go into transaction classes, click new, and define yourself a new transaction class. Now back into entities, the other thing that is extremely significant is fiscal time periods. When you build a cost plan, you plan out your project costs time period by time period. And you can't do that unless you have time periods defined. There are several places in Clarity where you have to define time intervals. One of them is for timesheets. One of them is for bucketing together things like capacity and demand and looking at allocations over time against projects. The other one is for creating cost and benefit and budget plans. So the latter is what this is all about. In order to create a cost plan that extends into 2020, we have to have time periods defined that extend all the way to 2020. At the moment, I've got 12 pages worth of cost plans. If I go all the way out to the end of it, I can see that I am going all the way out to 2020. So we do have cost plans that are defined that far. And the other thing to note is that we need cost plans that are, fiscal time periods that are quarterly, monthly, and annually. We don't do anything at the week level, so we haven't defined any time periods down to the week. So we do our planning at month level or aggregate it up from there. If we needed to go out to 2025, and I believe in production, I think we're already out to 2027, but haven't done it here in the development environment. I would click new, and I can create new annual plans. And I can give it a fiscal year, start date, and an end date, and save and return, and that will create for me a new annual plan. So if I wanted a new annual plan for fiscal year 2021, I would put that there. I would say 1/1/2021 and 12/31/2021 and save and return. So now if I filter this just to show my annual plans, then I have created a new one. The name is not in keeping with our standard, so whenever you create new fiscal time periods, you have to come in here and change the names to match the time, because that's created automatically for you. So you can't do it when you click new. And that is not yet active. So I haven't activated it. If I want to activate it, it's pretty simple. I thought there was an activate button. There it is. It's on the actions menu. I can say activate. And now I've activated a new annual time period. That's just annual. I'd have to repeat that process for quarterly and monthly in order to create time periods for 2021. So again, you just click new, you pick your time period, monthly, whatever, give it a range. You can actually create monthly values for years from 2021 all the way to 2027 in one step. But then you have to drill into each one of them and change the fiscal year to the appropriate year and change the label so that it matches our convention. So setting up new fiscal time periods is a bit of a pain, but as you can see, we don't have to do it very often. In production, we're now set all the way through 2027. So at some point when someone wants to start planning beyond 2027, somebody will need to go in and create new time periods if we're even still using Clarity at that point. So time periods are fairly significant. If I go back to our fiscal setup, oops, no, I don't want to delete. I want to go back to here. The other thing that is significant is locations. So there are 8 locations defined. These are very, very broad regions that are associated with AstraZeneca locations, departments, whatever. This is a significant list because we have a weird interaction between fiscal setup and OBS that's not immediately obvious. And this is one of the reasons trying to pull OBS data out of Clarity gets awkward. The department OBS is not maintained under the OBS link under administration like all of the others are. Instead, you go to the home menu and you go to departments. This is a non-hierarchical list of all the defined departments, which there are close to 300 of. If I want to define a new department, I would click the new button here and associate or give it all the appropriate information. Apologies for my ringing phone and my vocal ID. So the catch is, if I look at one of these departments, under the Properties tab, there is a subpage for locations. If I define a department and I don't give it any locations, it won't show up when I'm trying to choose the department OBS. So if I'm going to create a new, let me just get back out of here, and I hate it when they don't have return buttons on the screen. If I go back here and I say I want a new department, so I give it a name and I'll call it test department, and this is development, so I can do this, and I'm going to label it with my initials so everybody knows it's me fooling around. I have to associate the department with an entity. There's only one, but I've got to have that association. If it's part of the hierarchy, I can give it a parent department. I'm going to leave this one at the top, and I have to give it a description. So test department, just ignore this. And I don't need to be the manager, and I will say save. But now my test department is not going to show up when I'm searching for department OBS on a project or a resource because I don't have any locations associated with it. So I have to go into the locations sub-page, click the add button, and what I do is select them all and say add. And now it's associated with those locations. And now I can add it as a department. So the location field, I'm not quite sure where that comes into play as far as the financial setup, but I do know that you can't use department OBS properly unless you associate each department with at least one location. And if you go into a project and you find the page that has the location listed and you change it to something, the department is going to change automatically. That can happen. Or if you change the department, the location could blank out. So you encounter some oddities there. So just be sure when you set up a new department, always associate it with, ideally, all the different locations. The other things here, vendors might be useful someday if we ever utilize vendor transactions properly in Clarity, which we're not now. Currency, Clarity is set up for multi-currency because you have to do that when you install the system. But as you can see right now, the only one that's active is US dollars. And similarly, you can have exchange rates defined in Clarity, but we only use US dollars, so we don't need any exchange rates. There are none defined. So that is financial setup. Hopefully that makes sense. And as I said, if you need to know more about it, go to CA's documentation. It's pretty decent.